Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Slingshot from levees.org. And as you can see, it's Mardi Gras time. The Slingshot is a podcast by levees.org, and our mission is to offer coverage and commentary on the global events which matter most to you, our listeners. And today we're going to discuss fact checking. You all know me, Sandy Rosenthal, and today I'm joined by Stuart Loeb and Rudy Vorkapic. Stuart, we're going to start the conversation off with you. Are you ready?
I am.
Great. Here we go.
Well, uh, with regard to facts, what are facts is the first question you need to ask when you talk about fact checking. And, you know, where, what is the source of your fact? How is it vetted? How much do you trust the provider of the fact, whether it's a journalist, a friend, a social media posting? We've moved into a new world where vetting and verification is not just a simple matter of one competitive newspaper going after a story that where they suspect the competitor, has made some mistakes. It's facts or information that gets disseminated across social media with no basis in reality. And as we deal with this, you have to examine yourself. You have to continually have a sort of a self-awareness that what you're reading may or may not be true, and just assign some degree of credibility to it. And unfortunately, there's too much being taken today as absolute gospel. There are things that are being dismissed as just being unlikely or impossible. And that's what I think we need to be talking about today.
Rudy, you've got a background in journalism. Can you
Yeah,
tell our listeners a little bit about that before you
sure.
step into the fray?
Sure. I was a newspaper reporter, hard news reporter, and editor for 20 years in Chicago before I moved to New Orleans because there was this girl. And came down here and was freelancing when Katrina came, and that ultimately prompted me to start the New Orleans Levy newspaper, which was a fact-based, news-based, satirical newspaper. So every fact that was in that newspaper, everything that we made fun of, was vetted, verified, and not one comma, not one picture, not one anything was ever printed without me editing it, scrutinizing it, and making sure it was as accurate to my own standards, which are very high. I can honestly say that I had a very great reputation in Chicago as a reporter, as an editor, for being fair, to get both sides, to present them as equally as possible, and to be thorough about it, and would not let stories run commonly if there was any suspicion that that was not the case. And that's just the way I worked. I was editor of both my college. I went to two colleges. I was editor of both papers. I started out my first year in journalism was the one of the best places you could ever work as a journalist. It was the old City News Bureau of Chicago, which was portrayed in the old front page movies and by Ben Hecht and all these other greats from years ago. It was a 100-year-old institution owned by the Sun-Times and the Tribune, and it was a collective. It was like an AP. It was like an Associated Press that only covered Chicago. So they hired the youngest people because they were the cheapest people, and they threw you out on the street into the main stories, into the hottest stories, and you either sank or you swam. My very first story, I didn't know that you had to dictate your story written in your head to your editor after. So my first day, I called into the office and I was at a political rally and I started saying, well, this happened and that happened. And he goes, well, don't tell me that. Tell me the story. And I said, I didn't know I had to do that. He goes, well, call me back in 15 minutes or don't call me back at all. And so, and so that's how you learned at City News Bureau. You learned how to do it hard, fast, and right. And so facts and what's right and what's to be interpreted and bias are huge issues to me, huge issues. And yes, They're being skewed now. There are so many outlets right now that most of them are just going to be parrots of others who just want to give the impression that they did the reporting when they're just watching some other guy do it. And boy, that sounds good, but they don't have sources. They don't have they haven't been vetted themselves. They're probably, who knows if they were even reporters before this. Look at so many journalists on broadcast news right now. They were lawyers before they were ever in the journalism field. So they were taught bias in essence. To be honest, they were taught how to defend and how to get behind a certain case, as opposed to, their job was not to particularly vet anything and be fair. Either prosecutors or defense attorneys, or I mean, very few just become judges. So they all have their biases, and they all have their strange beliefs that they now are on TV and they call themselves journalists, and it's just not so. So there's so much bias. There's so many outlets that the entire product has been diluted. I don't think there's any way that you can say that it hasn't been diluted from the days when, when I was a boy, when I was a news junkie since I was a boy. I remember just always watching the news. I loved it. And, I started out when, there were only 3 stations. I'm sorry, but, I'm not that old, but I do remember that. And as it's grown, I mean, as you get more and more, you spread out the talent pool more and more, and that means the product has to be scrutinized more by the people who are taking it in, and whereas perhaps in a time it was easier to trust a fewer number of people because you saw them more often, and perhaps they had a bigger responsibility to their viewers because they were the only ones. Now that burden has really fallen on the viewer to really vet your information yourself in any way you can. And that is either by picking reliable sources, looking at what you're looking at, say if it's on broadcast, looking at it and seeing if they're using words like could or might instead of actually saying, this is who I heard it from and where I heard it. Unnamed sources have to be taken with such a grain of salt, and ultimately, I always go back to this fact, and this is the truest sentence I ever found in news, is that you have to remember that the news that you hear on a daily basis is the first report of history. It is the first day of what's happening in history. And so you have to take that as a grain of salt. News outlets that present themselves on the first day of an event as knowing everything, as know-it-alls. Here's what's happening. Here is what's happening. Those are the worst words you can use in news. This is what we believe to be happening. This is what we are understanding at the moment. It's the same thing with news. It's the same thing with polling. You name it. That's the grain of salt you have to take with. It is the first moment of what's happening, and ultimately it changes.
Agreed, Rudy, and also means there's errors with it, there's problems with it, and it's going to change as we move forward. I think that's implied in what you're saying, and I agree with you that the burden is now on the viewer. And not the way it used to be, where it used to be that we trusted our news sources to do the fact checking. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. The reason we're having this conversation today is because very recently Mark Zuckerberg announced that there shall be no more fact checking on Facebook. Something that they refer to as community notes. They're going to allow the community notes to do the fact checking, which basically means, if I understand this right, that means self-policing, and that's where we are now when it comes to Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, and it's also been going on with other news media that, and we'll get into that. But again, I wanted to pick up with what Rudy said. He said, now the burden is on the viewer. Stuart, what do you think about that? Is that a good thing?
Oh, it's always a good thing for the viewer to take additional responsibility and to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism. But it it's the ultimate responsibility for providing the news goes back to the source. And in terms of Zuckerberg himself, in his particular situation, there was an excellent piece from Carl Bodie, who writes mostly about the telecom business, where I just retired from. But he talked about Masnick's impossibility theorem. And what that theorem goes into is the scale of what they have to do to moderate on any of these platforms is unimaginably large. They've done a great job of building these platforms so that they can handle millions of transactions a second, 350,000 photographs per minute, I believe, on Facebook, for example. They are able to handle these things mechanically, but the moderation, even at 99.9%, you're still talking about 1,000 fails per hour on something that can go viral quickly. So I have, I won't say sympathy, but I have an understanding of why Zuckerberg would back away from this, back away from trying to staff up moderation in the way that Musk did when he slashed all the people at Twitter/X. It is a very difficult task to take a broad global platform with millions of users and billions of transactions, or tens of millions of transactions per day, and moderate all of them. So again, it has to go back to the user or the reader, the consumer, and then keep that grain of salt, keep that healthy skepticism alive. And that goes for every source. I was a diehard consumer. I still am a consumer of the New York Times, but it was in my 20s and 30s. To me, the New York Times could do no wrong. It was a wonderful paper of record, they called themselves. And they had wonderful writers then, they have wonderful writers now. But they've been shown to get it very wrong at times. One of them was Judith Miller. Go back to the Iraq War and look at that. Another is the recent article about Zuckerberg's drift away from politicization, and yet he's flying down to Mar-a-Lago from his place in Hawaii to kiss the ring, essentially, and then announcing this policy coincident with the advent of a new administration, where you probably need more moderation than less. Even if it's something of a futile endeavor, you still need to do it. So I believe that enforcing your own discipline in being skeptical and open to other sources about the same topic. You can't go get the original material yourself in most cases. Like here in New Orleans, we could, like Ivor von Heerden did, went up to the levee and saw the water lines. That was possible. But on something like a political machination in a North Carolina election, that's a controversy right now, about 60,000 votes, what can I do to get the original information about that? Not too much. I have to rely on other sources.
That's a burden on the viewer.
That's a burden on
the
us.
reader. So
Consumer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The and even people that you really trust, even they can get it wrong, and that's a danger we all have. That even someone you trust can be given bad information and can transmit bad information, even people we trust. So always be.
Nobody's perfect.
Nobody's
perfect. I mean, as hard as you try, nobody's perfect. But I have a different spin on that a little bit, Stuart, in terms of Musk and Zuckerberg, and I think it comes down to the reason that it usually comes down to, and it's money. I really believe it's money. And Musk, he's so overpaid for Twitter that that's why there's no moderation on Twitter, because he just didn't want to pay for it. And then Zuckerberg, like you said, I mean, he went down to Mar-a-Lago, he kissed the ring, and suddenly moderation is over.
And really, all Zuckerberg did, I'm not changing the subject. I mean,
Mhm.
right back to you. Really, all Mark did was whine. Oh, it's so hard, and I'm not getting
Right.
any credit for how hard I'm working, so I'm just not going to do it anymore. That's
Well,
basically what he said.
that's kind of
Anyway,
his
back to
MO.
you, Rudy.
Yeah, that's kind of his MO. I mean, he's a whiner. There are way too many whiners in this world these days. There are just, and they're everywhere. One's going to be president on the 21st. It's King Whiner, in my humble opinion.
Mhm.
They whine about everything. They drone on about everything that doesn't make any sense. But what they're going to create, they're going to force feed you more politics. That's what they think you want to see now. About 4 years after they thought that people wanted to see less politics. But that's what sells. They're not selling sex; they're selling politics, and that's what's sexy. And so that's what we're going to get force fed. And the comments are just like they did when this all started, and politics started to rule the day on social media. It's going to get ugly. I can't tell you how many times during the pandemic I ended up in Facebook jail. Many for just refuting the absurd. You get a week off. You're out for a week. You're out for a month. Something like that. And those would be very peaceful times. But you'd be back, and somebody would say something else, and you just couldn't believe that they were saying what they were saying about vaccines and social distancing and masking and just simple stuff that without it, obviously has cost us how many millions of lives that it's estimated. I can't even fathom the number anymore of how many people through false information who didn't have to die throughout that entire pandemic. Um,
Exactly. Self-policing, like the invisible hand of capitalism. Self-policing sounds so good. In theory, it's wonderful. Self-policing is what was used when this brand new thing came out that no one had ever heard of in 2005, and that was the ability to comment on a news article online, but you did it anonymously. Nobody used their real name. It was all anonymous commenting, and the theory was this anonymous commenting, they would self-police, and the system would just magically work by itself. Well, don't you know? Immediately it was abused. These anonymous commenters would come in. These were people in a position of power, disguise their identity, pretend they're not involved with the subject of an article, and use the anonymous commenting to attack people, not an idea.
Absolutely.
It was abused from the beginning to the
Absolutely.
point that pretty quickly, news sources like Time Picayune and then the New York Times, you could not comment unless you identified yourself. You had to identify yourself, and that would show up when you left a comment. And very few articles, very few news sources even do commenting anymore. The New York Times is one of them.
Hmm.
The Mark Zuckerberg article, had 1,500 comments in less than 24 hours. I'm surprised the New York Times even still allows it. But those, I believe you have to be registered with the New York Times to use it. But it's been 20 years. Very few news sources do it. Again, in theory, it sounds great, but the potential for abuse is just too great.
I would love to see that if you had to register your actual identity with these people to have an account, like a phone number. To be
Mhm.
honest with you, that's ultimately the only thing that will control any of this is if you're no longer allowed to post anonymously or make up or hack or make up things or make up accounts, and that's long been a problem. That's a problem that's led to criminality, let alone false information. And yeah, that's I would love to see that, but they will never do that because that would absolutely cut into all their advertising money, and
Yeah.
it's all
Yeah.
money,
Mhm.
money,
Mhm.
money.
As you've mentioned, and you're right, Rudy, money.
Yeah, yeah, and in terms of, I'm not a big. I used to love the New York Times too, Stuart. I used to love it too, and I know a little bit of the editor, Dean Beckey, who's New Orleans guy. you know? Um,
Yeah.
and, so I mean, I wish him all the best, but under his stewardship, I wish I could say more. And a lot of stuff has happened that, is, to me, more editor issues than reporter issues. They still have some great reporters. There's no question, and some of the writing is the best you'll ever see. But they've been done in by reporters that you seem that they should be uncovered. I was talking a little bit before we started that when I was an editor in Chicago, there was a particular reporter that I was an editor for on a series that she did. We sent her to India to do a big exhaustive series of stories. It was odd for the paper that I was at the time to do this, but we did it. And she went on to work for the New York Times, and she wound up doing something that discredited the entire paper and industry. Her name is Rukmini Kalamaki, and she at the New York Times began a podcast called The Caliphate. And in 2018, they discovered that her entire story, which was basically she had claimed to have found a guy who was involved with the Islamic State, and he was that he had committed all these atrocities, and she was getting him to admit everything that he had done and that had never been done before. And it turns out she made the entire thing up. She made it all up from just wasn't true. And when she did her story for us years earlier as a young reporter, she came back and she wrote this series, and it was really not written very well. But she was a young reporter taking on a very big task, so that's not the surprising part. But she had no attribution. It took me 3 days to edit everything that she was doing, and there was just a complete lack of attribution through the entire thing, and so that apparently just was a pattern that seems to have continued on. And you would think at a place like the Times, the editors would be snappy enough to really find that out. And it is just always beyond me how that never happened. And there's been other instances there that does make it scary. But then, on the other hand, you've got Fox News, and you've got things that are just completely made up. You've got they don't even have opposing viewpoints. I mean, look at that. That is always going to be a very big red flag. When you're watching something or reading something and the other side isn't portrayed at all, and the language is inflammatory as opposed to explanatory, always beware. Always beware.
Let's talk about Wikipedia for just a moment or two. Wikipedia is a great product. However, I want to point out Wikipedia recently asked me a question. They reached out and said, "Have you ever been afraid to post a edit to an article for fear of being harassed?" And I wrote back, "Yes." And I'm certain I'm not the only person. Well, first of all, why did they even ask me that question? It's interesting that they asked. And then the second is the answer is yes. And there have been times in my work of leading levees.org and trying to get the truth out about the true cause of the levee failure, where had I tried to put an ad, okay, I'll give you an example. Why not use a real example? I posted to Wikipedia the responsibility for the design and construction of the levees belongs to the Army Corps of Engineers. And one of the wiki gods, that's what I call them, the wiki editors, said, "Oh, that's point of view." I said, "No, it's not point of view. It is a fact." And they came back. I'm not making this up. And of course, Wikipedia is forever. I don't have to prove this. All you have to do is look up in the history of this article. You can see what they said to me. They said, by posting that responsibility for design and construction belongs to the federal government, people may assume it's the federal government's fault. My response was, now that's you using point of view, not me. But anyway, this is a real life absolute example, and by far not the only one. And this particular person was polite to me, but there were many examples where they were ugly and vicious to me on Wikipedia. In closing, though, I do want to point out that Wikipedia is a good product so long as the wiki article is not a controversial subject.
I've always found it to be a starting point. It's a starting point. It's a starting point. You know, you're going to get parameters. You're going to get some good explanations of certain things, and then, but it's nothing but a starting point. It's the same thing as what an encyclopedia was. It's a starting point. You know, this is going to give me ideas to go do something else, and but that's how I've always looked at it. It's a valuable tool, you know, but you can't treat it as gospel. You just have to treat it as a starting point.
Agreed.
You know, yeah, yeah. And then, let's see.
Well, I am a big fan of Wikipedia, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I donate to them so that they can remain independent. And there is, I've always thought, you know, always use the Britney Spears article as an example, although I think this is getting to be a dated reference now, that you take a current controversial topic and no, you really shouldn't rely on Wikipedia because it's too active. Sometimes they have to lock it down. But in general, if you want to look at general knowledge, like the other day, I wanted to see, you know, who was mayor when Huey P. Long changed the property tax laws in New Orleans to December so that the New Orleanians would have to pay two property taxes for 1934 and 1935, December to January, within a 2-month span. And easy enough to find on Wikipedia, it was T. Sims Walmsley. So those kinds of facts are not available anywhere else. Or if they are, you know, you'd have to go to a library or do extensive searching, and the search products have all deteriorated, especially Google has deteriorated to a great extent. There's a term out there, e-shitification, if you pardon the language, that a journalist has coined to describe how all of these things are deteriorating as the result of advertising and monetary pressures. Good thing about Wikipedia is it does not have those. The only pressure it has is to stay up and running, and then the rest of it is a non-economic motive. So I look at it as a very valuable resource, and you know, Elon Musk appreciates that because he offered to give them, was it $1 billion? I think it was $1 billion if they changed the name to Dickopedia for 1 year, and I hope they don't take it, but it's. Yeah, he would love to get control of it because a lot of the history, like the history of Tesla, for example, the history of PayPal, he is not exactly the white horse he makes himself out to be.
The history of Vivek Ramaswamy.
Same there.
Yeah.
Bobby Jindal. We could go on and on with that one.
Right.
But by the way, Stuart, I did give Wikipedia a little donation as well. It is a good product when properly utilized. Agreed. But speaking for just a moment about how the viewer, just the listener and the viewer to the media just doesn't have the tools to access information. A reporter for Chicago Tribune or Times-Picayune, they have access to tools that we just don't have. They have access to libraries and engines that we just don't have. Of course, they pay for those. Even something like the Associated Press style book, it's cost $300 for AP style book, which is really little more than just what's proper terminology. Viewers don't have that. Well, most viewers, a few viewers have access to these tools. And so there we are back in this conundrum, you know, should the viewer be left up? Should it be up to the viewer to do his own fact checking? I think it's cost prohibitive. I believe.
Well, I have a story about that. In the 80s, I went to visit my brother he was a DC, he was attorney in DC, worked for a major corporate law firm. And I was down at his office one Saturday and he showed me the LexisNexis machine. He said, look, you can type in a query and it comes back with an answer. Oh, this is cool. And so he went off and I started typing in queries and I had like, you know, a couple of pages of printed queries. He goes, oh my God, did you just do all of these? I said, yeah. He says, I don't know how much that's going to cost. We're going to have to bill that to overhead. He never told me how much it was, but it was apparently a pretty hefty sum for the number of queries that I issued to LexisNexis without realizing that each one was paid.
But that's a perfect picture of exactly what I'm talking about. LexisNexis,
Mhm.
Reporters have access to these engines that we mere mortals just don't have. So the burden is too great for all to be on the viewer. Although I totally agree with, I believe it was Stuart who said, no, I think it was Rudy, that maybe all of us, that we all should take even our favorite reporters working for our favorite news sources, take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah, but also um, the yeah, we had, I always had access to LexisNexis and everything throughout my reporting career. But the greatest experience since then is that I happen to know a lot of great people that do a lot of great things. So I know a lot of engineers, I know a lot of lawyers, I know a lot of people, I know federal prosecutors, I know city prosecutors, I know just a whole array of people that help me form my opinions that allow me to present them to other people. I mean, Sandy, you and I mean, you're one of the greatest citizen journalists I'll ever know. You're up there with Karen Gadbois and so many other greats. I mean, it's remarkable what you've done, and I'm so appreciative of it. And I know H.J. Bosworth, a source for me, and with engineering questions, and Clark Thompson, and just so many people around town who I rely on for my information. That's where I'll vet. I'll get my information from different sources, then talk to them, get another opinion. It's royal. It's like it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And then conversely, let's not forget about where our youngest kids right now, it seems, are getting their information. A lot of them are getting it from social media. A lot of them aren't even getting it from traditional news sources at all. And
Mhm.
I know my youngest daughter is 13, and during the election, she was looking things up on TikTok, or things were coming up on her TikTok. And I remember one day she came up to me and she goes, TikTok says this Robert Kennedy is a pretty good guy. And that was about a 3 week long conversation we ended up having, and told her some of the things, and she was just cringing. I had her cringing at TikTok, which was, I found it to be a major accomplishment for myself as a father. But so that's an issue. I mean, and now with fewer guardrails, it's just going into the brainwashing and the real brainwashing, not even blatant, not even hidden, but a blatant attempt to present news that isn't true, and that's what this is going to be. There's no good outcome for the decisions that they've made right now, which seems to be par for the course in our society. Sad to say.
And here we are. Stuart, do you have anything you'd like to add? We're about running out of time.
I would just think quickly a footnote to what Rudy just said is that with with regard to TikTok and social media sources, in the past election, the guy who actually won, I don't think has the strategic brain to have come up with this, but the people who promoted him, they knew what they were doing by using TikTok, using social media, and ignoring traditional media entirely, which was entirely lined up against him with moral arguments as to why you shouldn't vote for him. They sidestepped that with TikTok and managed to appeal to baser instincts of people, and that pushed us to the 1.4% that put him over the top. And now we're going to have 4 years of this. And I think you're seeing buyer's remorse already, but that's where we are.
That's where we
That
are.
is where we are.
Rudy, did you have a little quip to share with our listeners before we go?
Oh, about the mayor?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have time to fit that in.
Well, in our last podcast, we were talking about safety in the New Orleans on Bourbon Street after the horrific attacks, and
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 we
I
all
was
are in our Mardi Gras finery still.
absolutely, and so I mean, I was making my point that I'm very opposed to Mayor Cantrell's leadership on this, and it doesn't seem to me that she should be the expert, and that she holds a lot of blame for. One of the reasons is that because you know no one has greater experience at sneaking into the French Quarter to do things improper than our mayor. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, well, it's a nugget. It's a nugget. So
She has a very different idea of what a bollard is.
oh, I thought I had something there,
Oh.
Stuart. Love it. Absolutely. This is true. So yeah, there we go.
Thanks, Rudy. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks for joining us. We had another really interesting, very interesting conversation. And thank you, the listener, for joining us. Please like, subscribe, and rate this podcast on all of your favorite platforms. That's the Slingshot from levies.org, and we'll see you later. Okay, y'all stay with me. I just have to stop recording.